Hello, everybody, and welcome to this symposium. My name is Anders Hector, and I will be moderating this session. Everything that we say will be said in English or Korean, and you can follow a stream on English or Korean. There will also be a box where you can ask a question to the speakers or to me, and we encourage you to do that. But first, before we start, I want to introduce our host for this symposium, the Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Daniel Wolvén. Please join me at the stage.
Thank you, Anders. Dear participants, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this symposium on the award of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences this year, 2021. The subtitle is Revolutionizing Empirical Research by Showing Cause and Effect in Natural Experiments. We will hear today from Swedish and Korean experts about their views on the award, about the researchers and their work, and what it is that they have achieved, and what research in the economic sciences mean for development of society, especially in the context of South Korea. Everybody is welcome to these sessions on the Nobel Awards. I hope we will be reaching those of you that are either experts or just interested and curious about the topics that we will discuss here today. This symposium is organized by the Swedish Embassy in Seoul, together with partners in Sweden and here in Korea. And let me just underline how incredibly important these partners are to research here in Korea and to cooperation in research between Sweden and Korea. I extend my deepest appreciation to each and all of you, and especially to the Korean Development Institute for your valuable support to this symposium on economics. And we now turn to the prize in economic sciences. Thank you for your attention. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Ambassador. And as mentioned, we turn to the Korea Development Institute for congratulatory remarks by Senior Vice President Ki-Wan Kim. Dr. Kim received his doctorate in Germany at the University of Bielefeld, if I'm correctly informed, and have since then been working at the World Bank and then at the Korea Development Institute. Dr. Kim is today a Senior Vice President and Chief Management Officer at KDI, and we are very happy to have you here. Dr. Kim, welcome.
So, thank you very much for kind introduction. And His Excellency Daniel Wolben, Ambassador of Sweden, ladies and gentlemen, participating from both Sweden and Korea. On behalf of Korea Development Institute, KDI, I feel very much honored to take part in this important event today and would like to congratulate the hosts on the successful organization of this program. As you may know, the KDI, as a top public think tank in Korea with 50 years of history, has been conducting policy researches related to domestic and global economic topics, and has contributed to the rapid economic growth of Korea through its research and policy advice. KDI's main function is to provide evidence-based economic analysis and advices on concrete policy issues. Therefore, this year's Nobel Prize for Economics is much more relevant to the KDI than any other years, since it was awarded to the scholars who have substantially contributed to the improvement of the rigor of empirical research and the policy evaluation. Sweden and Korea have a few similarities. Both countries are very strong in innovation capabilities and innovation investment, and both countries are regarded benchmarking countries who have achieved economic growth as well as social inclusion. And both countries have a strong outward orientation and a great willingness to collaborate with partners. In this respect, I hope today's event will provide an important momentum for productive future collaboration between two countries. And once again, I would like to thank the host for inviting KDI to this important event, and look forward to having a wonderful discussion among participants both from Sweden and Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Universities are among the most important institutions in society for exchange and experience and mobility of students and researchers. And in the following, we will hear some welcoming remarks from the 5 universities that we are partnering with for these sessions. And I will introduce them in order, and you will see them in brief video messages. President of Ewha Women's University, which is where we are, Eun-mi Kim. And then President of the University of Gothenburg, Eva Wiberg. President of KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Sigbritt Karlsson. President of Lund University, Erik Renström. And President of Umeå University, Hans Adolfsson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program. As president of Ewha Women's University, I would like to welcome and thank everyone for attending today's program. It is my great honor to co-host this event for the second time with the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul. I would like to express my deep appreciation to His Excellency Ambassador Daniel Wolben and the Swedish Embassy for their efforts in making this event possible. This is a great opportunity for our students and the youth to broaden their views and accumulate knowledge, since it is not every day that students can listen to great discussions amongst world-renowned experts. As Ewha has had a long tradition of educating students to become global leaders in any field and break any gender and other barriers as they move forward and upward, I believe today's program will be inspirational. As we host this event at our campus, I hope that we will be able to congratulate more women and Ewha graduates in not too distant future on their groundbreaking research to become Nobel laureates. As we prepare to open the stage to discuss this year's Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, I would like to congratulate the 3 laureates. Dr. David Card of the University of California, Berkeley, Dr. Joshua Angrist of MIT, and Dr. Guido Imbens of Stanford University for providing new insights about the labor market and how natural experiments can help us uncover the cause and effect, which has been very difficult to do in social sciences. Their work has inspired many economists as well as scholars in other fields and will provide a lasting impact on how research will be conducted in the future. As a social scientist myself, I was fascinated to read about their work, and I very much look forward to learning during today's discussions. I hope you will all enjoy today's symposium. Thank you very much.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Weiberg, and I'm the president of the University of Gothenburg. I'm honored and proud that my university is part of this excellent Nobel Memorial Program. And I wish that I could have been with you in person to take part of the presentations. Due to the pandemic, this is of course not possible. The pandemic has brought us many challenges. Perhaps the most important of all for the higher education community is for us to preserve and nurture global conversations, like this one between Sweden and South Korea. The University of Gothenburg is a broad and comprehensive university with a strong research focus. One of our strongest research areas is within political science and in public opinion, democracy and elections. In this field of political science, there is also an established research collaboration with Yonsei University. The collaboration is also strong within education, where the university has exchanged 200 students with Korean universities over the years. We are hoping that this is only the beginning of an intensified collaboration in education and research with the Korean higher education community. The Nobel Prizes are the greatest celebrations of science. In the year of 2000, the same year when Kim Dae-jung from South Korea was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Arvid Carlsson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Gothenburg, was one of 3 laureates in physiology medicine. A celebration of science, truth and facts, such as the Nobel Prizes, are of increased importance in challenging times when the international community must act jointly to fight a pandemic. It is with pleasure and pride I see the development of this joint collaboration between our 2 countries. I hope to meet you all in person in Korea during next year's Nobel Memorial Program.
KTH is happy to be partner in this event, and in times like this, it is even more important to keep connected. KTH is the oldest and largest technical university in Sweden with attractive education and world-leading research. KTH is an international university with some 30% of faculty having international background. Yearly, we have an inflow of about 1,000 international students. Korea is important to KTH for further exchange of students and more of excellent research collaborations. With KTH being an international leading engineering university, we'd like to deepen our collaboration, as Korea is a world-leading nation in engineering and innovation. I see many similarities and mutual interests. I would like to see more Swedish students going to Korea to tap into the world-leading education and research, but also to learn more about the Korean culture. In the coming years, I'd like to see more research collaborations and more of academia-industry collaborations. Being a part of this Nobel Memorial Program, I just have to take the possibility to tell you about a real pride for KTH, Hannes Alfvén. He is our first but not last Nobel laureate. Professor Alfvén got the Nobel Physics Prize in 1970, and he is considered a pioneer in the field of plasma physics, and his discoveries play a crucial role in today's space research. I have visited Korea a couple of times, and it's a fascinating country. Already in 2013, I joined a delegation of Swedish rectors who visited a large number of excellent universities in the Seoul area. I have really enjoyed my stays. I was impressed by the high quality of the universities and the amazing labs for experimental research. I look forward to once again come back to Korea in real life. For us at KTH, this event is an opportunity to further engage KTH in deeper discussions to increase the ties with your wonderful country.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Lund University, I wish you a warm welcome to the Nobel Memorial Symposia. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic that has plagued the world for a year and a half, academic institutions all over the world are in the process of contemplating the lessons learned and trying to navigate in a partially new landscape. All over the globe, decision makers and us academics try to articulate the clearest idea about how to move forward after the pandemic. Frequently, the center stage of these plans is occupied by us and what we do: education, science and innovation. Sweden has a long and solid reputation as a country where the value of innovation and research is highly regarded. The Nobel Prizes are excellent testimonies to this notion. Personally, I feel strongly about this year's prize in physiology or medicine. Myself being an MD PhD and ion channel researcher, I'm in awe of the achievements of David Julius and Arden Petaputian for the discoveries of the receptors for temperature and touch. Swedes admire great advances in science, medicine, arts, and appreciate their importance for building a sustainable and democratic society. Therefore, South Korea is a country that we feel close affinity to. You cherish the same values about important matters in life and nurture science and innovation. We all hope to be able to meet you in person soon again to maintain, no, strengthen the bonds between our countries. I wish you all a stupendous meeting.
Dear friends of Korea and Sweden, my name is Hans Adolfsson and I'm the Vice Chancellor of Umeå University. We are very happy to be part of the second Swedish-Korean Nobel Memorial Program today. Last year, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the groundbreaking discovery of the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors, one of gene technology's sharpest tools. At the time of the discovery, Emmanuelle Charpentier was a visiting professor at Umeå University. She often mentioned Umeå as a place where she really could focus on her research and that the university provided a great platform for networking and sharing ideas. Umeå University's strong research areas include, for example, global health, infection biology, plant and forest biotechnology, aging and population studies, and Arctic research. The university campuses encourage cross-border meetings between students, researchers, teachers, and external parties alike. Through close collaboration with local and international stakeholders, we contribute in making new and exciting things possible in society. This is of critical importance now, when we experience a huge sustainable industrial development in the north of Sweden, building plants for car batteries and green steel production. Umeå University has been collaborating with the Embassy in Seoul since 2013. We currently have 7 partner universities in Korea and would like to develop further partnerships and to extend the relationships regarding research collaborations. I personally had the opportunity to visit Seoul in 2014, and it was a great experience. Therefore, I do look forward to visit Korea again soon as it's possible. And hopefully next year's Nobel Memorial Program physically can take place in Seoul. In the meantime, I hope that you will enjoy this year's program and do take care.
Thank you very much for those welcoming words, and we also look forward to seeing you here in Seoul as soon as possible. So this session is on economic sciences, and it's a special area since it's the only social sciences area for the Nobel Awards. Coming from social sciences myself, I think it's of course the most important of the Nobel Awards. It focuses on describing society and how we can make it better for ourselves. And what could possibly be more important than that? I don't know. But I want to introduce our first speaker, coming from, it's Professor Gauthier Lanoux. Professor Lanoux received his doctorate at the Université Louis Pasteur in Strasbourg. He has had a position at Keele University in the UK, Laval University in Canada, and Queen's University in Belfast. Now he is a professor at the Umeå School of Business, Business Economics and Statistics, Umeå University. The topic for the Nobel Prize Award is very much in line with the research interest of Professor Lanoux, which are empirical microeconomics and econometrics, labor and public economics and public finance. We are very welcome. We are very happy to have you here, and a warm welcome, Professor Gauthier Lanoux.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well.
We see you and hear you.
Very good, very good. So perhaps I can start my presentation.
And we see your presentation as well.
Oh, you see that too. Excellent. I can't see that on the return. Fair enough. So today we want to celebrate the achievements of 3 economists, 3 empirical economists. David Card on the one hand for his empirical contributions to labor economics, and Joshua Engrist and Guido Imbens for their methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relationships. And what I plan to do in this short discussion is to try to explain why this matters so much to economics. And essentially what they show us is how we can learn from experiments or experiment-like setups. And this is a quiet revolution in economics, because in general, we start most of our lectures in economics by saying, well, economists can't manipulate an economy, and therefore they cannot generally design experiments. And that leads to lots of methodological developments, mostly in the theoretical part of economics, and possibly not as much in the empirical part of economics. So this is obviously not completely true. There were experiments that were designed, in particular in the United States. There was a New Jersey negative income experiments early in the 60s and 70s and until the 80s, and there were many other forms of experiments of this kind, and most recently I think there was one in Finland with the universal income, but these are kind of rare. So if designing experiments is difficult, then understanding the effects and causes, the effects of causes is in general difficult to get to. So how do economists who cannot generate experimental data, how will they learn about the world? And that's essentially what David Card, Joshua Angrist, and Guido Imbens show us how to do. And we have to kind of think why these people actually got to that point. And before the current new data or large data revolution, there was another data revolution in the 60s and 70s in the social sciences in particular, with the appearance of large household or individual survey data. And the fact that people suddenly recognized that they could use this kind of data to do economic analysis and to design policy. So this is kind of interesting, or this was very interesting. And the first hope was from survey data, we would learn about behavior of individuals as opposed to behavior of economies under the constraints that they face. But the large methodological difficulty there was that this kind of data is observational. So it's a bit like a cosmologist looking at stars. The cosmologist cannot move the stars. The only thing that the cosmologist can do is to look at the stars. And the analysis early on was really trying to address these observational features without perhaps explicitly accounting for the natural experiment features that were present in the data they were looking at. And that led later on in the 90s and the 2000s, and even still nowadays, to lots of discussions about whether the analysis of observational data is actually believable. And there are lots of technical terms there. In order to analyze observational data, you have to make assumptions about the kind of behavior you can observe. So this leads to criticism in terms of specification choices. And once you've made those choices, then the next type of criticism against results that are based on observational data is that they may not be very robust. The results, not the data. So enters the idea of a natural experiment. Well, it's an experiment or something we can think of as an experiment, which arises in a natural way, hence the name, but which is not designed. And in order to be able to analyze such data configuration, essentially you need an accident, something you don't quite control, but generates an experimental setup, and you need rich enough data to allow you, as we will see shortly, to understand the consequences of the accident on behavior. And natural experiments are actually quite powerful. They can be very informative about a mechanism, which economists quite like often. But we will see that in the case of CARD, they provide at the same time factual evidence and in some cases new measurement. Another very important aspect of natural experiments is the statistical analysis is relatively simple. The analysis of observational data is in general very difficult, whereas relatively speaking, the analysis of natural experiment is fairly simple. Simple doesn't mean it's easy, it means it demands fewer resources in terms of computation, I guess we could say. So let's try to understand what an experiment actually is. And this is my representation of the simplest of experiments in possibly a natural science context or a medical context. But in a natural science context, it's possibly the best. So we could think that each of my two shapes on the screen there represent copies of the same population. So here you really have to think about, at least in this ideal version, that the population of individuals you're looking at are possibly like white rats, very specific type of individuals that have been bred to be as similar to each other as they can be, very homogeneous, and there is a population that you will apply some treatment to, So possibly you will give them the jab against the virus or the COVID virus, and then there is a copy of that population to which you will not do anything. So you have a population that is treated with some treatment, and then you have a population that is left alone as a control. And then you possibly release the COVID virus in those two populations, and then you compare, that's what we do in the next stage, you compare which population does better, either in terms of survival or in terms of symptoms, or in any other terms that you think is relevant. And the beauty of experimental setups of this kind is all the thinking is done before the experiment is actually conducted. Once the experiment is conducted, you have done your measurement, the analysis of the result is fairly simple. And in this very ideal presentation, I jumped a slide, so I come back up a little bit. We kind of expect that homogeneity between the two populations, and because we are very good scientists and we understand the methodology well, we apply systematically the treatment to all the members of the control group. So essentially the rats, they have to take the shot, they cannot run away, or if they run away, we'll catch them and we'll apply the shot to them. So in a sense, we reduce everything that is different between the two groups to simply the application of the vaccine, for example. In the context of a natural experiment, that will seem a bit artificial, but this is important in economics and in medicine as well. We do not really have two populations. We have one population, and we try to divide that population into two groups in a random fashion. So in the context of the randomized controlled trials in medicine, often the population is determined by a protocol that says that person can be part of the experimental design, and then there is a flip of a coin or something of that kind that says, well, if you're a head, you're part of the control group. If you're a tail, you're part of the treatment group. And in principle, once you're part of one group or the other, you cannot cross over. You're not allowed to cross over. And in principle, again, once you're part of one group or the other, you cannot withdraw yourself. You cannot take yourself out of that. And of course, in practice, these are substantially difficult parts of the running of an experiment or of a randomized controlled trial. So the natural experiment takes more or less the same route and says, well, suppose we can divide our population into two groups in a random fashion that is not controlled or not manipulated by individuals in the control groups or individuals in the treatment group. In the context of observational data, we may have a similar setup where there are differences between people who are exposed to a particular kind of policy and people who are not exposed to a particular kind of policy, but often people will try to find out what is best for them and then may want to cross over. And it's that potential for choice of being part of the control or being part of the treatment that makes observational data so difficult. In the natural experiment context, we really think that we have a randomization of the population such that people cannot switch between one treatment or control part of the experiment. So here we have a very simple natural experiment where we expect, or we think first that the response is homogeneous and the exposure to the experiment is homogeneous as well. No one has more or less of the treatment if they are treated. So what can be the source of this type of random allocation to the treatment group? Well, it could be that that's the best case. It could be the outcome of a lottery, and that's a device that Angrist and others have used. They've used the lottery for becoming drafted into the US Army during Vietnam. It could be an accident of birth, so your date of birth. Again, Angrist has used that sort of information as a randomizer, or possibly the location of birth. That sort of accidents, as I put it. More generally, it could be the fact that the rules for a particular policy declare some differences between people and which define eligibility, but really these differences may be arbitrary, and certainly individuals cannot manipulate the rules once they are set up. Location is another good randomizer, and that's a device that has been used, for example, in the study by Card and Kruger on the minimum wage, where location around the border of those fast food restaurants was the randomizing device, if you wish. But as I said before, the important part of an experimental design is that the measurement and the analysis, once we have recognized the presence of a natural experiment, all that is relatively simple. We take measurement from our two halves of the population, from the control part and from the treatment part, and then we compare across groups. If we observe a positive difference on average, we will say, well, the treatment has had a positive effect on some outcome. If we observe a negative difference on outcomes, on the other hand, we will say the treatment has had a negative effect. Right. Things become a lot harder, and this is where I touch on the contribution of Angrist and Imbens here, when the response to the experimental stimulus varies between people, and when the exposure to the experiment is not homogeneous in the population. So here on my graph, I try to represent this by my various red lines. So you have a vertical line, random line, you could say, that divide the treated and the control. So the control on the right-hand side and the treated on the left-hand side. And then you have those horizontal wavy lines that perhaps in our abstract representation here divide between different groups where either the exposure or the response varies. The exposure to the treatment and the response to the treatment varies in the population. Now, the analysis is much harder because heterogeneity, differences between the subjects, makes the response to the experiment a more challenging object to measure and to define. And that is essentially the contribution of Angrist and Imbens, to show that this is still possible to understand the outcome of a natural experiment where heterogeneous response and heterogeneous exposure arises. So I've alluded to this, and I'm getting to the end of my presentation here. David Card puts the natural experiment as the center of some of his analysis of labor market data. And in particular, the analysis that was very striking in the 90s was that study of the effect of the minimum wage on employment and other outcomes. And it was very striking because this was an American study, not a study from everywhere else. And the consensus was, well, a minimum wage can only be a bad policy. And indeed, that may explain why the minimum wage level in the US in real terms has remained quite low over the last 40 years or so. But what they showed, and this was an impressive piece of work because it showed a lot of foresight. They collected data before a change to the minimum wage policy, federal minimum wage policy in the US, and then after a change, they made sure they contacted many of these restaurants at the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They collected lots of information about these restaurants before and after the change. And what they found, which surprised, I guess, many, was that an increase in the minimum wage does not necessarily have a negative effect on employment. And of course, there has been analysis and reanalysis of their data, possibly sometimes with different outcomes and reinterpretation of what they were showing. At first, there has been other ways of thinking about the negative effect of the minimum wage, etc., etc. But this was a kind of revolution. Here is a labor economist from one of the leading universities in the United States that suggests that the minimum wage is possibly not, or possibly doesn't have negative effects on employment, which went against much of the basic labor economic view that most academics would have. And what would explain this finding? What would explain why the minimum wage does not decrease employment? Well, in their book, Card and Kruger suggests that perhaps the market power of firms on the labor market is part of the story, and explain why firms, in response to an increase to the minimum wage, would not necessarily reduce employment, and in some cases may actually decide to increase in employment. So this was a landmark contribution, and the paper in the American Economic Review is very accessible. I teach from it to my labor economics class here in Umeå, and I think the students get very quickly what the point of this study is. So this, to my mind, is actually a substantial contribution to economics in general and labor economics in particular. As I tried to explain earlier on, Angrist and Imbens, their contribution is more methodological, or the contribution that the Nobel Committee has singled out is more methodological, and it really shows how you can analyze these very complex types of data. And these methodological ideas are now fairly widely used inside economics and outside of economics in the wider social sciences. And these are kind of important contributions, because they show that knowing some econometrics, understanding what matters and what is possibly less important, actually leads to our ability to understand the world around us. And to that extent, the contribution of Angrist and Imbens are very, very significant. I finished by giving you some references. Perhaps the one that many people may want to read, because it is quite accessible, is that first book by Angrist and Pischke, Mostly Harmless Econometrics. It's a good book to read. I think the paper by Card and Kruger is a good paper to have read. But you can see that that doesn't stop there. There are many other contributions. For those who are more statistically inclined, the book by Imbens and Rubin is a must read as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lanois. That was very interesting and enlightening. And we will come to a discussion later, so please stay with us. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Yoon-Soo Park. Please, Professor Park, join us up here on the stage. Professor Park received his doctorate from Princeton and worked after that as a research fellow at the Korea Development Institute. He is today assistant professor at the Department of Economics at Sukmyung Women's University. Professor Park has a research profile very much in line with the awards this year and is practicing their methods, and I'm looking forward to hear more about that. He and his colleagues are using lab-in-the-field methods and a quasi-experimental intervention of teaching methods to study how teaching practices affect the formation of student networks. And he studies the causal effect of single-sex school attendance on academic achievements by using a choice-based high school lottery program in Seoul. All that is quite understandable, actually. We will now hear about the winners and how their work manifests the spirit of economics to solve real-world problems. A most warmly welcome Professor Yoon-Soo Park. Please sit or stand as you feel most comfortable with.
Thank you for inviting me here. And please excuse my use of Korean language.
Please go ahead.
For the convenience of Korean audience. 예, 저 오늘 발표를 맡게 된 숙명여자대학교의 박윤수라고 합니다. 오늘
I will
제가
be presenting. I
발표드릴
am
내용은
Professor Park
제목은
Yoon-soo
Hard English
at
and
Sukmyung
Intensive
University,
자연실험
Women's University,
혁명.
and the title of my presentation is Card, Ingrist, and Imbin's Natural Experiment, Revolution, and the Implications for the Korean Economy. So it's going to be difficult for me to cover their achievements over the span of 20 minutes, and I was also asked to talk about the implications on the Korean economy, so I will have to focus on the key points. So the three laureates, first of all, Professor David Carr has been awarded half of this year's Economic Sciences Prize for his empirical contributions to labor economics, and Professor Ingrist and Professor Imbins took the other half for their methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relationships. So, empirical contributions to labor economics and methodological contributions to the analysis of causal relations, how are they related? Natural experiment would be the keywords that brings together their achievements. And so these researchers were able to answer the important questions in labor economics using natural experiment. Now, I won't repeat what natural experiments mean because Professor Lano covered that very clearly, and I would just like to share some examples. So this was published by Ingrist and Kruger in 1991, and I am going to share with you 4 studies today. And aside from 2 from the Nobel laureates that I'm talking about today, 2 have been contributed to by Professor Alan Kruger. And just as an aside, he has recently passed away and therefore was not selected as a joint winner of this year's Nobel Prize because the Nobel Prize is not awarded to the deceased, and I believe that he might have won if he had been alive. Now, on the horizontal axis of this chart, we have the years of education. And on the vertical axis, we have the level of income. And in every country or society, the more years of education one has, the higher those people's income is. However, the question here is whether there's a causal relation between long education and higher income, or competent people with reason to have higher income simply have also received more education. So this was trying to answer the question of the causal relation between education and income. Idealistically, we would be running a controlled experiment. For example, let's imagine that there is a dictator who randomly assigned students into 2 groups, young children into 2 groups. One group would be allowed to go to school for 12 years, and another group would be allowed 13 years. And after their schooling is over, we would compare their incomes. And we would look at how much there was a difference in the income between the 2 groups. And in natural sciences, of course, we would run these tests on lab rats. But this is a social science. The science of economics is a social science, so such controlled experiments are not possible. So that is why Engrist and Kruger made use of natural experiments, which are experiential situations that arise naturally. On the left side, the yellow bars represent the average number of education for people who are born in the first quarter of the year, and the blue bars represent the number of years of education for those who are born in the fourth quarter. We see that it is uniform that people born in the fourth quarter have more education than those born in the first quarter. This is because of the compulsory education law of the United States. I won't go into much detail here. But anyway, the quarters that people are born in are very accidental. And at least it will not be related to the inherent competence of that person to generate income. However, because of American compulsory education law, those who were born in the first quarter would start their compulsory education at a later age compared to those born in the fourth quarter, and this study was making use of that natural situation. And on the chart on the right side, we see the incomes of those people. We see that people who had longer schooling, those who were born in the fourth quarter, turned out to have more income. And Engrist and Kruger found out that one more year of education results in about 7% higher income. Now, moving on to the next study. We have Imbens and Engrist's study. Then the question here is, the 7% wage returns on education would be an average return. And each person would have a different return on education. For some people, education will be very useful, and they will have around 8% of returns on their schooling. However, other people might have only 6% because they don't thrive on education. And the question was, which group the 7% average return would apply to? And their conclusion was that in a natural experiment, there was a local effect that was found only on the group that the natural experiment impacted. So this is about the limitations or how we should look at the results of a natural experiment. So I would like to dig into this a little bit deeper because it can be complicated. So there are 4 groups of people in this world. That's the assumption. There's always takers, never takers, compliers, and defiers. People who would always stay in education longer, whether or not there was compulsory education, and then there are the never takers who would not take an additional year of education, whether or not it's compulsory. And there are compliers who would take one more year of education if it is compulsory. And then we have the 4th group, the defiers, who would not take an additional year of schooling if it was compulsory. And the 7% average effect was a very local effect that was found only in the compliers who would take another additional year of education if there was a law that mandated it. And so compared to a controlled experiment, in a natural experiment, the effect was very local. It was only applicable to compliers. Now I have provided the implications here. So recently in Korea, for adults to have more education, the government issues vouchers to make adults take education or training courses. And again, we have the 4 groups of people. We have the always takers who would take the education courses whether or not they are given vouchers. And the second group would not be taking the courses whether or not they get vouchers. They're the never takers. The third group would only take the courses when they are given the vouchers. They're the compliers. The 4th group are the defiers who would only take the courses when they are not given vouchers. And it's very important to only issue vouchers for those who are the compliers. However, if this voucher is just open to anyone, then the people who would be most enthusiastic to get the vouchers would be the always taker because they're interested in education. So the point here is the group that shows the highest participation in policies are not always the same as a group that makes the policy effective, and the government has to be very clear about that. Now, Professor Lano described this study in detail, so I won't go over the details again, Card and Kruger's 1994 study. I'd just like to share the implications. Raising the minimum wage does not always cause unemployment. That was the ultimate conclusion. Now, to go into a little more detail, I will look at two opposing cases. When does a rise in minimum wage negatively impact employment? If you look at the situation of the labor market, if many employers are competing to obtain highly mobile workers, that is the labor market that we are thinking of. So the productivity that the worker contributes to the employer would always be equal to the wage that they are paid, because they are very mobile, and if they are producing more than they are paid for, then they would move to a different employer. And in that case, if the government raises the minimum wage, this would result in less employment. However, in reality, moving to a different job is very costly for the workers, because they have to say goodbye to their colleagues, they have to move, they have to get their kids in different schools, new schools. And there's something that economists call monopsony power, that is a monopoly that the employers have over the workers. And if the employers have a monopsony power over workers, then wages can be set below productivity. And a reasonable minimum wage increase may not cause unemployment. Actually, because the minimum wage had gone up, more workers might join that market and it might contribute to a higher employment. To sum up, how the minimum wage raise impacts employment would depend on the market situation. If it's perfectly competitive, then the minimum wage rise would decrease employment. But if it's imperfect competition market, then the minimum wage rise might increase employment or decrease employment. And let's look at the implications for the Korean economy. The Korean labor market is very dualized. It has a dichotomy. There are larger corporations and SMEs and small mom and pop shops and self-employed. And then we have the permanent versus temporary workers. In which market or which sector will the minimum wage more negatively affect employment? This would probably be the SMEs and the mom and pop shop sector, and the temporary workers, because the workers are more mobile. And actually, if the minimum wage goes up, there would be a decreased employment in the market where larger corporations are more prevalent. Then when it's a favorable time to raise the minimum wage, that is when a large difference between wage and productivity exists. But if the economy is bad, then there would be a slim difference between wage and productivity. And if there has been a minimum wage increase, then the slim difference would be even slimmer. And in those cases, if minimum wage goes up, then employment would go down. Now, on to the last study. This is a study on immigration. David Card tried to address the common understanding that if there's an influx of immigration into a certain area, then it will be harder to find jobs there. So to answer the question, David Card focused on a very interesting example that took place in April 1980. Fidel Castro of Cuba announced, for political reasons, that he would open the port of Mariel so that Cubans who wanted to leave the country were free to go. Of course, I don't have time to cover the details of that situation, but anyway, as a result, from April to September 1980, hundreds of thousands of people set sail to Miami from the Mariel port, and as a result, 125,000 Cubans landed in Miami. and that contributed to 7% increase of Miami's labor force. If this is converted to fit the Korean situation, because we have around 28 million workers in the market, it would amount to 2 million people being added to the market. Now, what would happen? The assumption would that there would be higher unemployment and lower wages because there was more supply of labor. And Card looked at this natural experiment situation. He analyzed this massive immigration and its impact on the Miami labor market. And surprisingly enough, over the span of a year, the massive immigration did not affect the wage and unemployment rate of Miami. So the lesson to take here was that we often think that the size of population and employment have a causal relationship. We often assume that the total number of laborers in a certain market or the total number of jobs in the market is going to be constant. So that is the implicit assumption that we usually make. For example, when we're thinking about a longer retirement or later retirement age. Economists call this the lump of labor fallacy. The lump of labor policy refers to the total number of jobs within the economy never being constant, while people often believe that it's constant. In 1980, the number of jobs increased with elasticity to quickly absorb the sudden influx of population, and what mattered here was capital was mobilized. And of course, all labor is useful, but there has to be capital and investment that is quickly mobilized to absorb and make use of that labor to prevent it from negatively impacting the market. And in 1980s Miami, investment in the textile industry was able to play that role. And now, lastly, let's look at the Korean situation. What are the implications for the Korean economy? The compulsory retirement age was quite controversial. In 2016, Korea set the compulsory retirement age at 60. It was quite controversial because many people assumed that pushing back the retirement age would lead to an increase in youth unemployment. And Dr. Joseph Han of KDI had a very important research project here. He analyzed the impact of extending the retirement age on youth employment. And he found that each worker benefiting from extended retirement resulted in 0.6 more older people being employed and 0.2 less younger people being employed. So here we have the implication that the older people replace the younger people. And this shows that Korean labor market is not as flexible as the labor market of Miami in 1980. But the fact that it wasn't a one-to-one replacement, in other words, the older generation saw 0.6% higher employment, while younger people saw 0.2 lower employment. And this reaffirms that the total number of jobs in an economy are not fixed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and some very modern data as well. Very interesting. I haven't heard about that with the unemployment. I was aware of the unemployment age, but not that effect. We're going to have a discussion about that. But first, I want to invite a guest to our panel discussion, Joseph Han, that was mentioned just now. Please join us on stage. Dr. Han is a research fellow at Korea Development Institute. Welcome, please have a seat. Dr. Han received his doctorate from University of Wisconsin-Madison, currently working as a member of the 5th Mid to Long-Term Strategy Committee of the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Maybe you'll have to explain to us what that is. And a member of the Association for Research on Aging Society in the Economic, Social and Labour Council. You're very, very welcome. And thank you. I have a question for you to start off. And the question is, how you are obviously utilizing these methods that have been awarded. I'd be interested to hear how you're doing that. And a follow-up question to that will be, is it a method of choice? Is it like you are using this method because it's an interesting and useful method, or are you only using it when it's relevant for your work and you're using all kinds of other different methods as well? I'm going to ask that question to all three of you. But please, Dr. Han, you start first.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. And I will speak in Korean.
Yes.
As to the questions that you just proposed, as for the body that I am with, the fifth Mid to Long-Term Strategy Commission, it's a commission under the Ministry of Finance and Economy to deal with the mid to long-term strategies. So it's as simple as that. And as for the methodologies, is it a matter of choice or is it because it is relevant? I guess it varies from researcher to researcher. Depending on the research question, I pick and choose the methodologies. As was explained in the presentations, if I need to approach with a natural experiment, then I use that approach. But if that methodology has some limitations, then I go with the traditional model based on some econometrics and controlled experiments. So it depends on what I am researching.
Professor Lano?
Yes, I couldn't hear you just now, but I think this is the same kind of answer as Dr. Han said. It depends on the question you ask, and it depends on the kind of data that is available to you. If you have rich data that contains natural experiment features to it, then perhaps it's better to use that natural experiment feature because it's going to be a simpler kind of analysis. Of course, this is a difficult position to have on all questions, because natural experiments being accidental, it's very unlikely that all the questions we want to ask can always have a natural experiment equivalent in the data we are looking at. So when there is no natural experiment, then you have to find alternatives. And that is essentially the difficulties that economics, and I'm sure all the social sciences have methodologically, when we want to say something about causal relationships and we don't have a neat experimental design in the data, then we have to find other ways and possibly lose on the clarity of analysis or lose on the robustness of the analysis, etc., etc.
Oh, I see. Thank you. And Professor Park.
제 대답도
Well, my answer, I think, will be along the same lines. So at the end of the day, it would depend on the research question. So the methodology that we employ would depend on the research question. But I actually had a question. If I am curious about causal relations, then I would look for a natural experiment situation. And if I'm not able to find such a natural experiment situation, then we'll have to employ stronger assumptions. And if the assumption is stronger and robust, then we often say that we get further away from hard science. And the research methodology would depend on the research question, is my answer as well.
Can I ask you, Professor Lano, if you can hear hear it in English when?
Yeah, I can hear. I can't hear you very well.
Oh, you can't hear me very well.
I don't know whether this is personal, but
maybe it's my microphone. If it's a problem, you should come and help me. But okay, I'll speak a little bit louder. I have another question for all three of you, and maybe we can start with Professor Park. So in economics research, you have several considerations to make. One is the scientific robustness and the quality of what you're doing and the soundness of the work and the quality of the data and all that. And another is the policy implications and the governance issues that are the consequences of it. And I'm curious as to how the research field is dealing with this, if there is a tension between these two different things, or if you as researchers find that you are consequence neutral in some sense, that you are only interested in the data and the results, and the policy issues are up to someone else, and I don't care very much about that. Professor Park, what are your thoughts on that?
좋은 연구라 하면
So for a very robust and good research, then there should be, of course, academic contribution. And at the same time, it should be able to answer questions for policy, and that would improve the importance of that research. And the studies that I've shared with you, especially those of the laureates, were very balanced in both aspects. But to prioritize I would prioritize the academic contribution. 하지만 굉장히 최저임금은 논쟁적이지 않았습니까? Well, about controversial, of course we want to avoid that. But if we just don't over-exaggerate the outcomes of one's research, then it won't really lead to political tension. Because we're trying to search for facts, and we are delivering the facts as we have found them. So, for example, the natural experiment between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, in that case, we found that minimum wage increase did not decrease employment. If we just accept that as a fact, then there would be no reason it would have to be politically controversial. If we, for example, state that minimum wage increase never decreases employment, then that could be controversial because it's exaggerated. And if the researcher doesn't exaggerate their research results, I believe that we can avoid that political tension.
Yeah, please talk to Han.
네, 저는 여러 가지
when there are many policy options, you have to weigh the different benefits of each option. And I think empirical research is needed to prove the benefits of the options. So you have to rely on the methodology, and you have to show the facts and the results as they are. Not, having some controversies or having some options be loaded or have prejudice. You should have an open discussion. But sometimes fact-finding may not be enough. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic, you need to make decisions on the fly, but we cannot have all the empirical data within such a short period of time. Then what you can do is base your assumptions on the past data and go on your common sense, and then you have to fill out the blanks. So for some of these actions that need to be taken immediately, we may have to rely on the scientists' common sense. I work at KDI, and so I'm not a pure scientist. I tend to weigh more on the policy implications. I think, I go for the policy implications rather than scientific endeavor.
Sorry, you're talking to me again.
Yes, I'm sorry. I am.
That's quite all right. No worries. I think the reason why a lot of research is done in economics is about the design of policy. And it's kind of interesting that economic research is quite strong in lots of countries which are democratic, we could say. So I don't think there is such a strong opposition between what we do and what the policy or the governance objectives are. We may disagree on the finer details, or we may disagree on a particular policy, but I think the mechanism through which information goes from, say, the science or the economics and the empirics back to the policy is quite natural and works quite well. It is true, though, that some options are often not considered either by economists or by policy creators. So, for example, in the US, the minimum wage has not been the kind of policy that people were willing to look at for a long while, but this is clearly changing after many years. I don't think there is a tension. There may be disagreements, but I don't think there is necessarily a tension, at least not in democratic societies. That doesn't mean there is consensus. Some people still disagree with the idea that the minimum wage could be a good thing. And other people will disagree with the opposite idea that the minimum wage is always a good thing. So that's why we have elections.
Yes, that's a very good point. What I'm getting at a little bit is I'm curious in how you see the field of economics as having developed in the last decades. It seems to me it's quite different from when I studied macroeconomics in the 1990s. And it seems more robust these days. It actually seems to be having more science credence than it did in the 90s. Less subjective and more scientific in some sense, even if maybe a physicist would disagree about how scientific it is. But what I want to ask you, starting with Professor Lanois, is when you see the awards of economics, would you say that they are controversial in terms of awarding the most relevant areas and also awarding areas that are incrementally making it more scientific, or is it just is there some other characteristic that are typical for the awards? Do you follow my question?
Yes, I think the Nobel Committee is a bit mysterious. But it tries, as far as I can tell, it tries to have an overview of the discipline of economics. And the discipline of economics is actually very, very wide. There are people who are interested in labor economics, like I am, but there are other people who have interests in political science or the application of economics ideas to the design of political institutions. There are people who are interested in development economics. There are people who do finance. There are people who do macroeconomics, as you explained. And even within macroeconomics, there are lots of different flavors. And so I think that what comes out of the prize is that sprinkling across the disciplines of economics, and which shows how lively the discipline as a whole is. It feels as if it's a sprinkling, but I think there is a large body of economists that generate lots and lots of work. So that's a positive view about it. That said, I think there are very few economists in general. I mean, I compare myself, or the department in which I work, to the department of, say, sociology, of political sciences, and they tend to be bigger than departments of economics. Economists are not that many. So this should kind of decrease a bit the positive view of the breadth of the subject.
Dr. Hahn, do you agree that economics is becoming more and more scientific, or do you find it difficult to answer that question because you're biased, because you're an economist?
Actually, both yes. 둘 다 맞다고 할 수밖에 없는데.
Yes, I would say that I answer yes to both sides of that question. Yes, I am biased as an economist, but anyway, from my perspective, I believe that the research in economic sciences has become much more robust because more empirical research has been conducted compared to theoretical research. For example, macroeconomics, the parameters that are used in macroeconomics research uses much more data, and so the assumptions that are coming out from that has become much more reliable than the past. Yes, if I could add on to what my two colleagues have said, I believe that economic sciences, compared to other social sciences, has a much more scientific structure. First of all, because it has a framework. There's the price and quantity, and there's supply and demand. How the price is determined in a market, the economists have models to explain the phenomenon, and then they use data to test those models. And this leads to it being much more scientific than other social sciences. But as Professor Lano mentioned earlier, with more data becoming available in economic sciences, we see an increase in empirical research, and those trends are probably reflected in what we are seeing these days. The 3 laureates of this year have all conducted empirical research, and a few years ago, Professor Duflo, who had introduced empirical research, an aspect of empirical research, has won the award. And I believe that the trends do reflect the empirical side that is increasing in economic sciences.
About the new opportunities that we're having, you mentioned the use of data as an example, and I mentioned bias. Some new technologies becoming available, which is supposedly intelligent and cool-headed and unbiased, supposedly. I'm thinking of artificial intelligence and big data. Is this something that is entering your field as well? Are you even using this technology, AI, machine learning, or big data to make analysis of your areas? Or do you expect that it will become a much more important area? I'll start with you, Park, and eventually I'll come to you, Professor Lano, as well.
Well, machine learning and other emerging technologies are being employed in research in economic sciences. They are just being introduced currently, but I believe that economists will be using them across a broader base in the future. In some areas of research, it can be widely used. For example, for forecasts of economic trends, people are very interested in real-time economics, so big data is used to quickly collect data and base policy decisions on that real-time data. But at the same time, big data is not going to solve all the problems and questions in economics research. So just providing observations on data will not prove causal relations, but they can complement each other. Big data and AI can be used to complement research, and more methods to that end will be developed. And of course, that means that researchers like myself will continue to study these new emerging technologies.
Yeah, I think machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these new approaches to data are being used in economics. The difficulty is to know what do we learn from it. Often, not always, but often these methods are quite black box. So they are better use for forecasting. But when we are after causal inference, then you can't be black box. You have to be precise about what it is that you are trying to measure and why you're trying to measure it. And there it may be harder for run-of-the-mill artificial intelligence methods to function well. That said, Professor Imbens, for example, has some contributions in the application of some form of automatized procedure for the search of causal links in his most recent work. So I think it's a bit early to tell right now, but I would guess that artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques will eventually move to economics, but will be adapted to the very specific problem we in general have, which is that of data that is observational and facing large heterogeneity between the sources of data. And that is quite different from analyzing pictures and trying to recognize who is a woman, who is a man, or who is on a particular database, or so on and so forth. So the problems that engineers, say, at Facebook have with artificial intelligence are possibly not exactly the same as the problems that economists have with very large data sets that we can use, for example, in Sweden, register data.
Right. Do you think it would be possible to use AI to replicate older studies, economic studies? I mean, we know that researchers are not very happy at replicating what somebody else has done. You want to work on your own questions, and it would need to be something very extraordinary to be working on replicating someone else's, just to confirm that, yeah, they were right, or to be able to say, no, they were wrong. Do you think we can use AI to do that, to substantiate the quality of the research that we already have done? Professor Lano?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I know there are projects out there that try to systematically replicate papers in famous journals, and their replication rate, if I remember well, is not that high. It's between, I don't know, 33% and 50% or something of that type. If you want to be very strictly able to replicate on the basis of what the authors say, but maybe we put too much, not efforts, but a paper in a economic journal is possibly not there to live forever, and its findings should be confirmed and confirmed again. And the economy changes. So the paper of Card and Kruger in the 90s possibly doesn't really apply nowadays in the same way, because we are 30 years later. What we should do if we wanted to think about the effect of the minimum wage now is to do another study of a similar kind if we can. The economy changes so much, I think, over time and between places, that it's very difficult for me to always believe that these causal links are the same everywhere. So the fact that some studies in the past were not exactly what we expected, well, it's not best, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do some work on current ones. And the methodology, if it is clear enough, may be interesting enough to justify publication.
Yeah. I think I agree with you, and I think maybe we all believe that economics is economics. It's not physics or chemistry, and it has to follow its own logic and be measured by its own characteristic, and we're running a little bit out of time, but I want to close with a question. There's a lot of students watching these sessions, and I would like to ask if you have any recommendations for students. Either avoid this area or sell your area that you think is the most important, or be clever and focus on methodology, or learn AI and you will have the future in your hand. What would you say to a student considering to do research in economics? Professor Park.
저는 모르겠습니다.
Well,
먼저
it's hard for me to say.
할 만한 학문이라는
I would like to say that economics is an area that is worthy of studying, in particular labor economics. Among the many areas of economics, looks at social phenomenon and it looks at people. Therefore, the social phenomenon and situations can be better understood if you study labor economics. And I would like to at least say that this is a worthy area to study. I would like to say that not only in undergrad but also graduate studies, economics requires a lot of mathematical approaches. So this might sort of frighten students, and many of them might be scared away from this area. However, if once you get beyond that stage, you will understand that in economics, observational powers and curiosity, and also a curiosity on what policies will be most desirable is going to be more important. And labor economics and certain areas of economics always looks at people. So many questions such as when people go to school, when people get married, when people get pregnant and give birth to children. And these very meaningful questions can be answered by labor economics. I would like to strongly recommend research in this area.
Professor Lano, do you also have a final advice to students interested in doing research or considering doing research in economics?
Well, I think everything in economics is interesting. I mean, that's the beauty of the subject. It's I wouldn't say universal, but it's very, very wide, and you can have a wide variety of skills that allows you to potentially contribute to economics. It is true that you may need some statistics, and you may need a bit of mathematics, and you may need to read lots of textbooks in your training, and I think that's right. But there are lots of other things that you need to do if you want to do good research in economics. You will find out that a lot of the Nobel laureates this year and in the past know a lot of details about the data they analyze, not just the data, but the institutions around that data. And so I think everything matters. If you want to do good research in economics, you have to be not too bad a statistician, not too bad an analyst of models. You have to be able to formulate research questions that have an importance for the discipline and an importance for policy. And you have to mobilize all the extra information about the particular problem that interests you. And that may be institutional, it may be about the law, it may be about cultural practices, it may be about the weather, it may be about geography, etc., etc. So, and that's what makes economics so interesting.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution with your time and for participating with us here today. So we're closing this session now, and I'm going to invite the ambassador to give us a few words for the closing. Thank you very much, and an applaud to the speakers. Yeah, you can step down. So, Ambassador Daniel Wolvén. Oh, stay here. No.
A big thank you to Professor Lano, Professor Park, and Dr. Han for this incredibly fascinating and insightful discussion. I wanted also maybe to pick up on what Professor Lano said, that everything in economics is interesting, and this is the beauty of the subject. And I think all of you have illustrated that in a very appealing way, also to our an audience which is comprised both of experts and of laypersons. So many thanks for your insightful questions, and also many thanks for making this subject so vivid. As you mentioned, this is a subject that has policy implications that in many ways can be quite profound. And to our audience, I would also like to say that anybody interested in the future as a researcher in economics is fortunate that there is still much to discover in this area. Today, the Bank of Korea and the Swedish Central Bank are exploring a digital currency, and the trend is that physical money is slowly disappearing or quickly disappearing. And what does this do to our behavior, and how do we teach our children the value of money when it is about abstract maneuvers on a smartphone? So there's a lot of questions really to continue to dig into in this fascinating subject. Much work remains to be done. We will have to move on. Our Nobel Memorial Program will continue and conclude with a session on literature. So I invite all of you to come back and follow our last session on literature. And this marks the closing on this session on the economic sciences. Thank you so much.